So yesterday and Friday in this very room, we had over 1,100 fourth and fifth graders in here worshiping Jesus, growing closer to God. It was just such an incredible thing to witness. Just this room packed with these little kids glorifying God. And so if you happen to step in something sticky or get a whiff of something unpleasant, or happen to hear the echo of the screams of a fourth grade boy, you're gonna know why. Speaking of the screams of a fourth grade boy, we're in week 2 of our series, Meltdown. And when I think of the word meltdown, I think of just falling apart. Like you've reached the end of your rope, your capacity, and you just can't keep it together any longer. Lots of emotions can manifest from a meltdown. Maybe for you, a meltdown has looked like anger, bitterness, and rage. Maybe it's been extreme sadness or despair or depression even. Maybe you're an internalizer and you simply shut down to the world around you. It could be that you medicate to numb the pain or rebel to get attention. Maybe you get lost in some vice that takes your mind off the realities of life. So today in part 2 of our series, we're gonna be taking a look at someone that experienced some great losses in her life that led to some bitter grief. Now the truth is we all grieve differently. One definition of grief is the normal but bewildering cluster of ordinary human emotions arising in response to a significant loss. And it's intensified and complicated by the relationship to that person or object lost. Now, sometimes we put a point level on how we should grieve, like the death of a loved one is a 10 points, but Starbucks running out of caramel flavoring is 1 point. Some people may grieve a death at a level 1, and some people may grieve the Starbucks thing at a level 10. Or maybe your football team losing at a level 10 in honor of Super Bowl Sunday. We can probably all kind of come to grips with grieving as a football fan, like some of these Cowboys fans from a couple of weeks ago. Cowboys fans. Many of you know our lead pastor, Nicomas, is a huge Cowboys fan. And if we would have let that video play on, you would have saw him burning down his office. He literally burned it down. We're all different. We're all different in the way that we grieve and the things that we grieve about. And you know, for so long, I would minimize my grief and loss because in the back of my mind, I knew that so many other people had lost so much more. So I shouldn't grieve as much. What do I have to grieve about? Sometimes I treated grief as not being grateful for what I actually do have. The reality is some people do experience deeper losses in life than others, but the reality also is grief is grief. Everyone experiences losses of some kind. It's part of the life journey, and like all life journeys, they seldom go as exactly mapped out or routed. You know, my kids' generation, they're never gonna know the pain of not having a GPS in your hand or in your pocket at all times. I mean, I remember pre-internet days when you had to go somewhere you didn't know how to get there, and you had to have someone give you detailed turn-by-turn directions, and you had to write them down on a notepad, like turn right on Chestnut, and then turn left on Lincoln. You're like, how far is Lincoln? They're like, I don't know, 5 clicks or a couple miles, or just when you see the sign Lincoln, turn left. And then the internet came along and you could punch in the address on mapquest.com. Man, God bless MapQuest. When I was learning how to drive and get my license, it could print out the directions and then follow those to your destination. But the problem would arise when a road was closed because there's no recalculating on a 3-page printed out map. If a road was closed, you just had to figure it out or drive back home and retype it all back in and print it back out again. That's probably why the detour sign has to be one of the more despised signs and frustrating things about going somewhere. You know, let's be honest, when you see this sign, there's nothing positive that comes into your mind. It's all negative. If it was supposed to be positive, it'd be a different color, like green or something. You don't see it and you go, yes, finally a detour. Because a detour is what is preventing you from getting to your destination in the most convenient and efficient way. What else does it do? It takes the control out of your hands. You wanted to travel this road to get to your certain destination, and now you can't. Now you're inconvenienced. Now you have to be less efficient. Now you may even be late because you can no longer travel the way you want to. You are at the mercy of the situation, and the detour is now in control of your journey. Maybe it's a 3-minute, 1-block detour. Maybe it's a 5-mile detour that takes 10 minutes out of your way. Regardless of what it is, you have to go through it. Sometimes we think we're smarter than the detour, right? I can't tell you how many times I approach a detour sign and I think, I'll show you a detour. Basically, you're not controlling me, Mr. Little Detour Sign, and I'm still in control, and so I'll go the opposite way and find a better way. Is it better? Nope. Did it take longer? Absolutely. But was I in control? For sure, I was in control. It doesn't matter to me that the road people know the best detour route. My frustration of the detour overrides that, and I will go ahead and take matters into my own hands. It's like that a lot of times in our life journey as well. You see, we all have a life journey mapped out. We have calculated it. We know what the best route is. Some of us want the quickest route to success. Some of us want the most scenic route in order to take life in. Some of us just want to avoid toll roads. I don't know what that metaphor is for, other than we're cheap, I guess. I don't know. The point is, from a young age, we map out our lives. We determine the best route to take. But there's one thing that we don't plan for, and that's the detour. And that's the detour. In the Bible, we see many people encountering detours in their life. These detours are often indicative of losses of every kind. Many of the people in the Bible, they experienced deep losses. Naomi was one of those people. Naomi's story is found in the book of Ruth. We're going to be in the book of Ruth today. And she is someone that faced a series of devastating losses, leading her into a deep and bitter grief. Now, the entire book of Ruth is only 4 chapters, but it only takes 5 verses to outline the losses Naomi would experience. So if we look at Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, they lived in Bethlehem, but they went to Moab to live there because of the famine. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Now they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." You see, in just the first 5 verses, we learn that Naomi was married, she had 2 sons, and was living in her home in Bethlehem, which was a land of famine. And her family packed up, they traveled to Moab, where there was food to live there. And it was about a 7 to 10 day journey to Moab. Naomi's husband would soon die in Moab, and her sons then married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And her sons would end up dying roughly 10 years after her husband. Now, a lot of loss here for Naomi, right? Her home, her husband, her sons. And the remainder of chapter 1 sets the stage for what is to come. And Naomi heard that it was safe to go back to Bethlehem, her home, so she set out with her 2 daughters-in-law. But then she told them, and we see this in verse 8. She says to them, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and she said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods, so go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So you have Naomi and Ruth. They travel back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem, and they vow to care for each other in their losses. And we learn just how much Naomi is grieving when she even tells people to call her Mara, which is the word for bitter. She says things like, "The Lord's hand has turned against me. My life is bitter. The Lord has brought me back empty and afflicted me and brought misfortune upon me." We see there's a lot of grief there, and we can understand that. To be living in a foreign land, forced out of your home due to a famine, losing your husband and your sons, there's a lot to grieve. And Naomi's story may not be all that different than yours. Maybe you have lost people close to you, or maybe you've lost something else. But the truth is this: we are not meant to go through life without grief. Whether it's sickness, death, loss of a job or opportunity, maybe it's simply life not scripted the way you thought it'd be. You thought you'd be married by now, or still married, or that marriage would be different. You thought your family would support you differently, or your kids would make different choices. You thought your friends would be more friendly than they are. You thought work would be more fulfilling. Maybe it's God. Maybe you blame God for the plights in your life. You wouldn't be the only one. Just crack open the Bible and read about other people that blame God. There is so much lament in the Bible. In fact, a book called Lamentations is a book in the Bible that is all about God's people expressing their grief to God. It documents the resulting peril of the Israelites falling to Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem. The book of Lamentations is a series of 5 poems that are intricately woven together and is considered a literary masterpiece in the Bible. Themes are evident. Trouble has come, Jerusalem's destruction. Grief is expressed. Restoration is prayed for. And in Lamentations, we see that God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but rather voice their protest, vent their feelings, pour it all out. We read a little bit in Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 19. It says, "I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have a hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him." Basically, God, I remember my pain and the bitterness of it, yet your compassion never fails. Your mercies never end. You are enough. And therefore, I will wait. I will wait for restoration. And while I wait, I will grieve. And the longer I wait, the more I will grieve. And the more my soul will grow in the likeness of God, because it's in the waiting that I will rely more and more on you. It's in the waiting that I will press more and more into you. What this lament reminds us is that the God of glory is also the son of suffering. The God of glory is also the son of suffering. Now, Nicholas Wolsterstorff, in his writing Lament for a Son, he records his reflections and struggles following the death of his 25-year-old son in a mountain climbing accident. He doesn't have any explanations or answers for why God would have allowed such a tragedy. Who does? But he writes, through the prism of my tears, I have seen a suffering God. It is said of God that no one can behold his face and live, and I always thought this meant that no one could see his splendor and live. A friend said perhaps this meant that no one could see his sorrow and live. Or perhaps his sorrow is splendor. Here's the truth. Jesus says it on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:4, that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. You know, sometimes we don't feel like we can grieve to God because we don't want to insult God or make him think we're not grateful for our lives. We treat him often like a boss at work, that we grumble under our breath or complain to others, but in his presence we praise and worship him. We can't let him think we're ungrateful or disgruntled, but God welcomes it. You just read through some of David's Psalms, and David was so sure of God's acceptance of him that he was willing to bare his soul before him, because there's nothing you can express to God that will lead him to reject you. He's not going to fire you for being disgruntled. On the contrary, he will sit down and he will grieve with you, because the God of glory is also the son of suffering. The point is this, we all experience grief. Although we all probably hope not to, we don't plan for it, but it's just unrealistic. Show me a person that has lived their life with no grief or pain or suffering. Show me that person so we can make a movie about them, right? But that movie would flop, because we all need a movie where the main character experiences grief. Why? Because that's life, and we want to see a story with grief so we can see a story of redemption. Now, there are different degrees of grief we may experience, or different degrees of loss, but no one is immune to it, and no one can escape it. I love how one person said it: the presence of grief does not demonstrate weakness, but rather it demonstrates that love, affection, or belonging has been felt. The capacity to love and be loved is inherent in the design of God. And when we love and value people or things, losing them just brings sadness. The reality is, with a word, God could remove all pain and suffering. There's nothing he cannot do, which begs the question sometimes, why doesn't he just remove it as quickly as possible? Fix the road, get rid of the signs. Let us move on. Just remove it, take it away. It's a nuisance. It's a hindrance in my life. I want to get back to what was mapped out, a speed bump. It's a roadblock to where I really want to go. I believe it's because there are times when the detour does more than get you to where you need to go. There are times that the detour shows you things that you've never seen before. There are times that the detour opens up your understanding of the journey that you are on. And while detours can be a disruption and sometimes even feel devastating, they can also reveal new routes on your journey that may lead to new revelations. See, Naomi, she experienced some detours in her life. And from leaving her home to unexpected deaths of family to returning home with not her husband and 2 sons, but with 1 daughter-in-law, it's not the journey that she had mapped out, but yet the journey she was on nonetheless. And in Ruth chapter 2, we're introduced to a man named Boaz. And Boaz was a family member of Naomi's late husband. He was what was called a kinsman redeemer. And in Leviticus 25, it explains what a kinsman redeemer was. It was a relative who could redeem what was lost. And this could be property, freedom, or even a name. The kinsman redeemer was essentially a rescuer and a restorer. And there were a few things that a kinsman redeemer had to do. Number 1, kinsman redeemer had to be kin or from the same family, basically be a relative. 2, they had to be willing. They had to be willing to redeem what was lost. 3, they had to have the means to redeem. They had to be qualified to do so. And 4, they had to pay the price in full. That was what a kinsman redeemer had to do. Now, Boaz, he checked all the boxes, and we find out actually that someone else that was a closer relative than Boaz. So Boaz brought this other kinsman up to speed. And this other kinsman says in verse 4 of chapter 4 that I will redeem it. I'll redeem it. Then Boaz lays out what happens when he would redeem it. He says in verse 5, basically, that's great that you will redeem it, but here's all the baggage that comes with it. And then we read on. It says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you're going to also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. It says this, at this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself because I can't do it. See, he was a relative. He had the means, but he wasn't willing to do it. And he didn't want to take on the debt. So Boaz did. And Boaz married Ruth, and they had a son. And we pick up in verse 14 of chapter 4. It says, the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. And as we know, that was the family lineage that would later bring into the world the Savior, the Messiah, Jesus. You see, pain and sorrows are the detours of life. Grieving is part of the journey. But the detour doesn't always have to take us down dark roads with potholes. God can use the detour to show you a new journey, to open your eyes to things you've never seen before. It can ultimately open up your understanding of the journey you are on, and it can open up wider your own view of who God is. And all this can lead to a larger soul for compassion and empathy towards others. Maybe it's the detour that takes you to a more direct path to the cross than where you were. Nobody wants a detour, but detours are part of life. And instead of knocking down barriers to stay on the road you want or you think you were destined to be on, maybe we just follow the leading. We allow the grieving and ask God to show you things on the new journey that you need to see. Maybe it's not about removing the grief from our lives, but rather redeeming it in our lives. You know, the story of Naomi wasn't about God fixing the things in her life that brought her grief. Nothing was going to bring back her husband and sons, and nothing could repair that depth of loss in her life. But even though her pain and grief would not be removed, it would be redeemed. And her name would be restored. You know, sometimes we just need to understand that grief is not a detour we need to avoid. It may be a new journey we need to take. And we can get so caught up on the word detour that we miss the arrow below, and it may be the arrow pointing us to something that we need to see. I love how pastor and author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzaro, puts it. He says, when we go to God in our grief, asking him to redeem it as opposed to removing it, our souls can actually enlarge. Basically, our empathy and our care, our compassion can actually grow in and through grief. We can look at our grief, our pain and suffering as a bridge to someone else's pain and suffering. And Naomi was able to love and care for and empathize with Ruth. And Ruth was able to love and care for and empathize with Naomi. Why? Because they had both experienced the loss, and they both had to grieve that loss. Jerry Sitzer says this, catastrophic loss by definition, it precludes recovery. It will transform us or it will destroy us, but it will never leave us the same. There's no going back to the past. It's not therefore true that we become less through loss unless we allow the loss to make us less, grinding our soul down until there is nothing left. But loss can also make us more. I did not get over the loss of my loved ones. Rather, I absorbed the loss, he says, into my life until it became part of who I am. Sorrow took up permanent residence in my soul and enlarged it. He says, one learns the pain of others by suffering one's own pain, by turning inside oneself, by finding one's own soul. However painful, sorrow is good for the soul. The soul is elastic like a balloon, and it can grow larger through suffering. The truth is that we cannot be the followers of Jesus we're called to be without walking through grief. We can't do it. Jesus didn't do it. Grieving is what stretches our faith to new levels. I love what John Mark Comer, he actually points out that there are 3 things that lead to the deeper work of spiritual formation in our lives. One, he says, contemplative prayer, which is basically we're practicing being in the presence of God throughout the day. 2, he says, deep community, which requires inviting people into our lives as we share in theirs. We can get behind those 2 pretty easily. He says the third thing is suffering. contemplative prayer, deep community, and suffering. And you're probably not going to see that on any church vision statement. 2 of those which we do on purpose, and 1 which is done to us. Without pain and suffering in life, we have only skimmed the surface of our faith. We're only experiencing the tip of the iceberg, and that's why pain and suffering are not interruptions in our faith, but catalysts of our faith. You see, when we treat grief as an unwelcome emotion, dealing with unwelcome interruptions of pain, then all grief becomes to us are speed bumps in our faith journey, maybe roadblocks in our spiritual formation. But when we lean into our pain and are okay to grieve in our season of loss, then what we do is we open the door for God to reveal himself in ways we never thought possible. These pain roadblocks lead to remarkable detours we never planned that may take us out of our way but reveal things we'd otherwise never see. What would it look like if our prayers went from, God, remove my grief, to God, help me experience the depth of your love in the depth of my grief? You know, we all go through seasons of life. The Bible outlines this in a pretty popular passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, lays it out, says there is a time for everything, right? And a season for every activity under the heavens. There's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And if you think of life like these actual seasons, right? There are seasons of summer in our lives where it's abundance. There's seasons of winter in our lives. It's kind of like death. There's seasons of fall, which are like transitions. We have seasons of spring, which are like rebirth and new life. I love what Parker Palmer says. He says, autumn is a season of great beauty, but it's also a season of decline. The days grow shorter, the light is suffused, and summer's abundance decays towards winter's death. He says, in my own experience of autumn, I am rarely aware that seeds are being planted. But as I explore autumn's paradox of dying and seeding, I feel the power of metaphor. And in the autumnal events of my own experience, I'm easily fixated on surface appearances, on the decline of meaning, the decay of relationships, the death of a work. I may see the myriad of possibilities being planted to bear fruit in some season yet to come, if I look more deeply. In retrospect, I can see in my own life what I could not see at the time. How the job I lost helped me find work I needed to do. How the road closed sign turned me toward terrain I needed to travel. How losses that felt irredeemable forced me to discern meanings I needed to know. On the surface, it seemed that life was lessening, but silently and lavishly, the seeds of new life were always being sown. I just want to end with 5 prayers to pray while grieving. And these prayers are found in the app, in the sermon notes page. And so you don't have to write these down or memorize them or anything, but these are 5 prayers to pray while grieving. And here's one. Jesus, thank you for being my redeemer. Redeem my grief rather than remove it. God, as I wait for restoration, guide me to notice the journey in the detour. God, help me to experience the depths of your love in the depths of my grief. And Jesus, remind me that you are not just the God of glory, but you are also the Son of suffering. And Jesus, show me how I can empathize and care for my own grief with others who are grieving.